Hello, I'm Paul Cheall and this is episode 118 of the Fighting Through podcast. Chapter 22 of my dad's book Fighting Through from Dunkirk to Hamburg. If you want to hear it from the beginning, then go back to episode 107. I'll say bye for now and on with the next chapter. Chapter 22. Back to Duty. 2 days later, orders came through for us to get packed and ready to move next day. After breakfast, the nurses, looking rather glum, came round the dining room and gave every one of us a kiss and said goodbye. They'd come to know us English boys so well that it was a sad time for them. One or two of the lads who'd regained some of their former cheek and bravado livened up the departure. We climbed into the trucks and were soon on our way. To where? As we left, the girls waved until we were out of sight at the end of the long drive. Next stop, a complete contrast to Orkmore, was a forbidding-looking place called Glencorse Barracks. Even the name seemed ominous. It was a few miles southwest of Edinburgh. It was a formidable grey stone building, a typical barrack block with scores of windows overlooking a very large parade ground, where, no doubt about it, many a new recruit had been broken in to the ways of that terror of young civilians, the regimental sergeant major. Fortunately, we were far ahead of that ordeal. Anyway, we were only more or less passing through, still on the way to complete recovery from our wounds. A vague and uncertain future lay ahead of us. I was pleased when I was told to report to a Nissen-hutted camp a quarter of a mile away. The torment of barrack-room living was not for us. My first impression of the Nissen camp was that it looked okay, being built on rising ground interspersed with large pine trees, but it was November, and Nissen huts in winter were not ideal accommodation, especially after the past 4 months of the soft life we'd lived. But this is the army, Mr. Jones, as the song goes. Just as well we didn't expect to be there for very long. We might even get to like it. But right then there were a few obstacles in the way, in the nature of not so good-natured NCOs. They seemed to be more than a little hostile towards us, probably because they knew we'd been part of D-Day and envied us the dubious experience. Or was it because we thought that they had a cushy number, while other soldiers were being put through the mill in Europe? Most likely we did, and that they had, but who were we to decide who should do what? Anyway, most of them looked a bit long in the tooth to be fighting Germans. The toughening up process was about to start, and being optimistic that my stay would be short-lived, I did my utmost to become reasonably fit as fast as my wound would allow. My leg was still giving me some trouble, and the jagged wound caused by the shrapnel was looking very angry, as was the cut in my backside, so I still had to be careful. The first thing on the agenda was an examination by the medical officer, who said that it was only a matter of time and I would not have any problems. Former wounded soldiers had been assembled here from various convalescent homes and were a mixed bunch from a variety of regiments and who kept their distance. "Ah, well, Bill," I said to myself, "be patient, they'll loosen up. Perhaps their wounds still bother them." But it was going to take time for them to loosen up. Happiness evaded me here. It was November, winter, isolated, bitter cold, and discipline was rigid. There was no camaraderie among the men. We were all strangers, and the officers had not undergone our experiences, so had no sympathy. We could have been raw recruits there to be trained. It seemed endless, and I longed to be back in France with my company. Several of the lads had suffered leg wounds of different kinds and severity, and we had to go for short, steady walks, which gradually increased in length and pace, but 15 miles was the limit until our legs became stronger. The nearest small town to Glencorse camp was called Pennychuck, which was 2 miles away, and since I'd palled up with a Geordie, we made several excursions into the town. But back then, in 1944, it was rather a quiet place, and since it entailed a 4-mile walk, we soon stopped that lark. Also, my new pal said that there wasn't any talent there, and said, "Bugger it," or words to that effect. Our next off-duty trip was to Edinburgh, which was 10 or 12 miles away. Neither of us had been there before, so we thought it might be interesting. It was a bitterly cold second week in December, and we decided to go into a little pub on Princess Street for a shandy. It was cheaper than beer, and the old problem of financial embarrassment still plagued us. 2 men, they'd be in their early 40s, came and sat next to us, and upon hearing our accent started to chat. As they were Scots, I brought up the fact that I was in 50th Division, and that we always fought alongside 51st Highland Division. That really set their tongues wagging, and they wanted to know all about the 51st, during which time they bought us a whisky, which almost burnt my throat, since I was not a drinker of spirits anyway. When we said we'd have to be going, they insisted upon shaking hands, and almost in unison asked, "Tell ye what, laddies, can ye nae come tae our Hogmanay on New Year's Eve?" Well, at that time I don't think I knew what a Hogmanay was, and they laughed and gave us a detailed explanation of what it was all about. It sounded okay to us, but we'd need a little time off from camp, which was most likely impossible. We said we would meet the Scots in a couple of days, same pub, same time. Next day I spoke to our NCO, who seemed to have softened a little towards us. I discovered that he was not a bad sort at heart, and he said he would speak to the captain to try and fix an interview for my mate and me. I was sent for next morning, and I told no fibs, just the facts, telling him about the Scots in the pub, and I asked if we could be allowed to stay out overnight. He was silent for a while, then suggested that since we were due for a 3-day pass anyway, he would grant permission, simply on the grounds that 1 night off camp would not be enough to recover from a Hogmanay, and were we sure we knew what we were doing? We had found a chink in the rigid routine at Glencorse. It was not so bad after all. We made the trip into Edinburgh to meet our 2 friends, who arranged to pick us up outside our camp during New Year's Eve, which they did. We first went to the same little pub for a drink, where the atmosphere was warming up, ready for the festivities. The drink over, our host took us to one of their houses, where we were introduced to his wife. As the evening wore on, more folk turned up, just enough to make a sociable gathering. We were the only foreigners present, and some wanted to know about us. Just to mention the 51st and 50th Divisions pleased them enormously. To cut a long story short, by the time it was midnight, we were just a teeny-weeny bit so-and-so, but not too far gone to hold hands and sing Auld Lang Syne. What happened after that? I haven't a clue. The mood of everybody was marvellous, all those Scots taking us 2 English lads to their hearts, and they looked after us for the 3 days, then took us back to camp. I had a very strong feeling that our captain knew all about Hogmanay. It was now 1945. Back at our camp, we both soon came back down to earth. The routine was still the same, with the aim of making our recovery complete, but it did not last long. 2 weeks later, a move came about, and from the start it proved to be a good one. Since I had only had the 1 3-day pass since early May, in 8 months, I went to the orderly room to inquire what the chances were of a leave before the move came about, and they agreed. Next day I collected my rail warrant and ration card for 7 days' leave. At the same time, I was given a rail warrant which would take me from my home to my new base. I was astonished to find that it was Bridlington on the east coast, only 70 miles south of my home. I knew Bridlington well. I was taken by 1500-weight truck to Waverley Station with all my kit, and I felt happy going on my first leave since well before D-Day. There would be so much to talk about. I looked forward with very pleasant anticipation to a few days with my family and friends. It would be many years before I rediscovered the beauty and memories of Scotland. So I found myself speeding on a train to Bridlington. When I arrived at my new posting, I discovered that it was a holding unit, mainly to make sure we were fit enough for further active service whenever the need arose. I was a shadow of my former self, but at least my mental attitude to events had been retained, and I would put every effort into regaining some semblance of my fitness prior to the invasion. Our billets consisted of requisitioned private hotels on the outskirts of the town, a couple of 100 yards from the seafront. We each had a single metal bed, 3 to a room. The first thing on the agenda was a medical parade to assess our state of health, which proved to be quite an experience since we were all single young men. We fell in on the road outside and entered the building in single file, then stripped naked, each man carrying his own clothes. We'd done this many times over the years and thought nothing of it, until the medical officer appeared, a female doctor of about 25 years of age. Nurses had seen me naked many times when I was wounded and at Dundee, but for most of us it was a new experience, and judging by the comments afterwards, they enjoyed being fondled by a female doctor. We started to undergo training within a week. The same almost basic training I'd done years previously, and we all became friendly. Many of the boys had not seen active service, as this was a holding battalion and would supply soldiers to active service units when they needed replacements for casualties. Before I was wounded, I was at the peak of fitness with the emotional attitude to match. I now needed more than anything the stimulus of more energetic activity, but there was a lack of sufficient intelligent activity to occupy our young minds. The worst possible thing for a soldier is to be undergoing the same routine day after day, requiring no thought or physical effort. That was the routine at Bridlington, and we were browned off. I decided that at the first opportunity I would volunteer to return to Europe, from where I had been ejected so suddenly by a piece of shrapnel which would change what remained of my life in the army. Although most of these lads had been wounded in the Normandy fighting, many of them had not experienced the trying conditions during long route marches and winter exercises as at Inverary to toughen them up, and none of that was forthcoming. It would be unwise to send them back to Europe in the physical condition they were in, and everybody did expect to go back into action at some point. The best thing about Bridlington was that we had a proper naffy, which was situated in what had been the Pier restaurant, and where we could go during time off for a penny cup of tea and to talk to a girl across the counter. They were good girls who tolerated none of the crude behaviour of some of the lads, whose talk and behaviour at times could be questionable. But when it came down to the nitty-gritty, they were good men. They all still belonged to their original regiments. I was the only Green Howard, and still had my Green Howard insignia. We were certainly a mixed bag. Many of them were interested to know how I came to be one of them, after I'd served at Dunkirk, North Africa and Sicily, then Normandy. As the only action they'd been involved in was Normandy, they pressed me to tell them about the other theatres of war. I often wondered how I had been lucky enough to survive. I was wishing I was with my old battalion, where we were all on the same level. For the first time, I came into contact with lads from London, but not Cockneys. I palled up with one of them called Tommy Chaff, who was younger than me. I used to laugh at his accent and his manner. It was so different to the northerners I had always served with. He had never been in action and was just waiting to be posted. I was just about fed up with the mind-boggling routine when a list was put on the notice board giving names of lads to be on a draft. Everyone knew it had to be Europe, and nobody cared. As far as I was concerned, there was only one problem. I was not on the list, but my new pals were, and I was fed up. So I thought hard about it, then asked for an interview with a company commander and explained my dilemma. He understood how I felt. When I asked to be included in the draft, my request was granted. I remember the anticipation of hoping that I would once again be joining the old 6th Green Howards. It was not until after the war that I learned that at the time I volunteered, the 6ths had been taken out of the line after advancing as far as Nijmegen in Holland. They were battle-weary and had returned to England and were stationed at Malton in Yorkshire in December 1944. Had I been aware of it, my decision to volunteer would certainly have been in doubt. However, in the end, things did turn out well for me. After 7 days' leave, I reported back to Bridlington, after which time we were soon on our way to Germany. It was February 1945. Although I didn't know it then, that move was responsible for meeting the girl I married. And listener, her name was Anne, my mum. Chapter 23. Hamburg and Peace. The way the war was going on at the time, it was March 1945. Surely it could not go on for much longer, or so we thought. But that possibility had entered our minds many times over the past months, and it still went on and on. We could never tell with the Germans. They'd lost the war, that was obvious, but their leaders would not surrender the total power they had over the whole population. Although the older generation German soldier seemed resigned to his fate when captured, the younger Hitler youth fought with tenacity, and when captured showed a great deal of arrogance. During the 3rd week of March, we had a kit inspection in readiness for our departure at the end of the week. The remainder of the day was free to do as we wished, but was spent writing letters or playing cards. Things were so different in those days. There was very little drunkenness or extreme bad behaviour among the lads. I know they used a lot of bad language and fantasised about girls, but at heart the British soldier was a good sort of chap, and talk about girls stimulated their imagination. There were about 50 men on the draft, and there was still speculation about where we were going. Once again, 3-tonners were used to take us to Dover and via a very buoyant sea to Ostend, though we had no chance of seeing anything of the place because we transferred off the ships straight onto trucks, from which vantage point we could return the waves of the civilians as we passed through their town, on the way to what proved to be a delightful place, Bruges in Belgium. Unfortunately, the war was still going on, and our thoughts were not really attuned to admiring scenery, but more to what lay ahead of us. We were billeted in a rather barn-like building, all timber, but situated almost in the centre of the town. For the first time ever, I found myself, even if only for a short while, billeted in a town centre. Bruges seemed to have recovered, at least on the surface, from the effects of occupation, but it would take years before the mental scars disappeared. The effects of the ruthless occupation for almost 5 years must have taken a dreadful toll on their way of life. The shops, although showing signs of neglect, I noticed this because of my pre-war business experience, had made some progress in bringing an appearance of normality into their various trades. Photographers were on the streets doing brisk business among servicemen, making capital out of the fact that friendly forces had arrived in their midst. They were probably just as enthusiastic when the enemy were amongst them. After all, business is business, but I'll wager they fleeced the unsuspecting Germans. I could not understand why we'd been sent to Europe. Instead of going to the front, we'd been billeted in a lovely city. But we were not complaining, just curious. We had ample time to explore the long walks and waterways and to admire the splendid town hall. Then I suffered a bitter disappointment. I was not to rejoin my old battalion, but had been unknowingly transferred to the East Lancashire Regiment. Me, a proud northern lad of the Green Howards, finding myself posted to a Lancashire regiment. At the time I was extremely put out. I'd been looking forward to seeing all my old pals of the 6th, supposing they'd all survived the battles taking place after I'd been wounded. Even though my cap badge had changed twice to other regiments, I was always a Green Howard at heart. How could I adapt to a Lancashire regiment? I would have to wait and see. The whereabouts of the East Lancs was quite unknown to me. We were told they were somewhere in Germany, which was very vague, and nobody told us what to expect. Once again, we were only numbers in the infantry. We stayed at these barracks sleeping on straw for 4 days, just waiting and waiting. Nobody seemed to know anything about what was happening at the front, and we did not have any newspapers now. During the 3rd week of April, we packed our kit for yet another move, as we thought, towards the action. No one ever told us how the war was going, and no radio was available, and the worst of it was that nobody seemed to know what to do with us. We travelled northeast through the flat countryside of Holland, and were soon upon a scene so familiar to those men of the paratroops. Arnhem, the graveyard of many brave young men, and of Market Garden itself. The slender hold the paras had on their positions was impossible to sustain. Everything had been against them, except their own determination and bravery to try and hold on and make the enemy pay very dearly until help could arrive. But it had been in vain. The help never arrived, and the operation failed. That was the countryside we passed through. Broken gliders, smashed jeeps, and equipment, and all the paraphernalia of a stubborn and grim battle lay everywhere throughout the once lovely countryside. What very sad and bitter memories the survivors, many of them crippled, would have to come to terms with. To never forget what at the beginning must have been a well-planned attack, but which went wrong. About 3 miles further on, we came to a halt at some large barns on a Dutch farm. We were to stay here for the night, sleeping on the straw which covered the ground. But first a good meal had been brought up to us, and then guards, including myself, were placed at intervals around the area. During the dark hours, as I walked about on guard, my imagination ran riot about what must have happened at Arnhem and in the skies above me not so long ago. It was impossible to believe that a catastrophe had taken place, and how very disillusioned those paratroops must have been to find the enemy so strangely entrenched, yet so soon after the inquest about the operation, it was now part of history. The 2 hours on guard and 4 hours off passed quickly. We had to be up early, and were feeling dishevelled, having slept with our clothes on, but a quick cold wash and shave soon livened us up. After we'd had breakfast, we collected our small pack, which contained our personal things. Our rifle never left our sides. If our kit was stolen, that was one thing, but our rifle was something else. After a roll call, we climbed aboard our trucks and continued on our way, still not knowing a thing about what was happening, just like so many parcels being delivered. Why couldn't somebody tell us something? We were completely in the dark until the next day. We came to a halt in a clearing, and an officer from the East Lancs addressed us, saying that negotiations were taking place about a ceasefire. Another roll call took place, and then the officer explained to us about joining the East Lancashires and assigned us to different companies of the 1st Battalion. Then, surprise, surprise, we were actually told where we were. Near Hamburg, which we could see in the distance. We stayed in those positions overnight, just sleeping on our ground sheets. It seemed so eerie to me, and everything was so quiet. When last time I was in Europe, the sounds of war were very near. I couldn't believe the possibility that it could soon be all over. Many times in the past it had seemed that it would never end, and now what we'd waited for so long was on the verge of becoming reality. Next morning, after making ourselves presentable, we queued for breakfast, then en bust. We were going to meet our new battalion. I knew from the start that I would be continually comparing it with the Green Howards. The faces of a great number of them still lingered in my memory, and it would feel strange for a while. We joined the battalion and took part in the few actions, clearing the enemy out of strong points. Then we crossed the river Elbe on a pontoon bridge which the engineers had put across. Hamburg fell without a great deal of hassle. The Germans were on their last legs. I decided, now the war had ended, to settle down in my new regiment. I had survived. I had peace of mind and knew that it was only a matter of time before I would be going home to a life I'd left so many years ago. I was now Bill Cheall, 4390717, HQ Company, 1st Battalion, the East Lancashire Regiment, and bound for a new experience. We were given a talk about our responsibilities and conduct towards the civilians, and then the order came for us to move forward and take up occupation duties. We were never told that the war had reached an end. It was just another day, and everywhere was so quiet as we finally came to rest on the outskirts of Hamburg. We then joined the companies to which we'd been assigned. It puzzled me as to why I'd been placed in the headquarters company. Perhaps it was down to the fact that at some time in the past, which seemed years ago, I'd been a cook and had also been number 1 on the mortar. The boys just talked to each other about what might happen now. Though nobody expected to be going home tomorrow, they were only too pleased that the danger had gone, and that all we had to do was our duty as it was explained to us. There were no celebrations whatsoever, not even a drink, nothing, to celebrate the end of such an evil catastrophe as the Second World War. To think that after all these years of fighting for our country, it was all over. It was almost uncanny. I decided to put every effort into my activities in my new regiment. The billets of HQ Company were ex-council buildings which had escaped any serious damage during the bombing. Just across the road, but at 9 o'clock from our billets, there was another large property in perfect condition, and it extended for about 40 yards down to a large lake. The building had been the home of the Geleiter of Hamburg, and he certainly seemed to like comfort. The place was fully furnished and untouched by the war. I went into the house and found several things of interest for souvenirs. A 7-inch dagger decorated with a swastika and tassel. A very large swastika flag. Boxes full of medals but no iron crosses. I ventured into a room about 15 metres square, which had shelves around all the walls, laden with brand new linen of all kinds, bedclothes, towels, and everything to do with a large household, just left when the occupants had fled. Another room, which must have been an office of some kind, was fully equipped as such, with a solid oak desk and many cabinets, all full of stationery. The whole house was magnificently appointed. I think the Geleiter and his staff must have been Nazis, because they'd fled before we arrived. Before I settled down for the night, I thought of the many things which had happened to me during my war, and how I'd been fortunate enough to have survived. For some time it was very hard to accept that the war was over. The sound of heavy guns and mortars, bombing and sniper fire had gone, as had the death-dealing mines. Also, the constant awareness that some of our lives could be snuffed out in a split second, the killing and murdering of civilians, and the occupation of the downtrodden countries. Now it was all over, and at the end it was we who were going to do the occupying. It was the responsibility of the East Lancs in our sector to keep order, but in a peaceful manner. We had to adopt to an entirely new way of life. No more military exercises or 30-mile marches. Who cared if a Bren gun weighed 22 pounds? Never again would it press into our shoulders when it was our turn to carry it. D-Day was 11 months behind us, but their memories would be with us far into the future. We were the first soldiers in our part of Hamburg, and being rather towards the outskirts, it was not too badly damaged. Yes, we did the occupying all right. To start with, a patrol consisted of 9 men, 1 section and an NCO, carrying loaded rifles just in case of any public demonstration. We would walk around our designated area, and after a while the patrol consisted of only 2 soldiers. The German civilians, mainly older men and women and young children — the older children had been drafted into some kind of war effort — seemed to be utterly dejected and downtrodden. Everybody looked weary and hungry, unable to imagine how this could be the end of all the mighty power the German war machine had wielded in the past. These were the people who had shown no mercy to anybody standing in their way. They must have been suffering mentally as well as physically under their tyrant masters, because of the terror tactics employed by the Gestapo. I wondered if they expected sympathy and understanding from us, unlike the Gestapo's lack of compassion for the subjugated peoples of Europe. But the Allies were different. We were not there to browbeat the German people, and there would not be any intimidation on our part. We would do our job in a correct and peaceful manner, and that is how we went about it. No resentment was shown towards us, and they accepted their fate unquestionably. They'd lost the war and were pleased to see the end of it, so accepted the conditions of peace. The laws we worked under were strict. Under no circumstances were we allowed to even try to make conversation with them. We just went about our duty, quietly and purposefully, letting them see by an uncaring attitude towards their fate that they deserved all they'd got. I felt that they could not understand why we'd made no attempt to converse with them. But, and it was a large but, we were not by nature the aggressive and heartless bullies which the SS had turned out. We were very perceptive and sympathetic in our approach to a very delicate situation. There was a very noticeable absence of boys and men, who of course had all been absorbed into the defences. After a while our army command relaxed the fraternisation ban, and under special circumstances our lives were made a little easier to conduct when we could, if necessary, make a gesture of almost friendliness towards the people. The 1st Battalion, East Lancashire, was a regular army unit and would be expected to perform duties wherever the War Office decided to send them, but at present there were very few full-time servicemen in the battalion. It consisted almost wholly of soldiers like myself, who'd been called up, probably become a casualty, and sent to a holding battalion. There was a great preponderance of territorial army and conscripted men. Given those conditions, the 1st Battalion comprised men from most parts of the country, not just Lancashire. About 4 weeks after I joined the regiment, it seemed so strange to me. I was issued with a cap badge, shoulder flashes, and divisional signs. It was now official. I was no longer a Green Howard. Almost at the same time, I received a most welcome letter from home, which contained a very pleasant surprise, a wound stripe, and more importantly, my 8th Army ribbon, which had been sent by the War Office. I felt like a dog with two tails because I was proud to have been in Monty's 8th Army. I had a right to be proud too. I'd not up to that time seen any other East Lanc wearing that special ribbon. After I'd put it up, the lads wanted to know where I'd been in the Middle East. 2 days after I'd sewn on my ribbon, I was passing my company commander, and after returning my salute, he asked me to wait a moment, then asked me my name. Next morning, I was told by the sergeant major that the company commander wanted to see me in his office at 1300 hours. I duly went, and he asked me about my service. At the end of the interview, he asked that as I was a senior soldier, would I care to join the regimental police with the rank of Lance Corporal. I didn't have to give an immediate answer, but could let the sergeant major know the next day. I did think about it and wondered how it would affect my relationship with the lads. I'd never sought promotion, had always put the comradeship of the lads first, and I felt I might jeopardise the friendship I'd always enjoyed with the other ranks. But the war was over now, and for a change I had to look at things in a different light. I had a disturbed few hours, then made up my mind to accept the police position. I'd always been conscientious and knew that I could adapt to any given situation that I might find myself in as a consequence of this. I never regretted it. I put up my stripe and felt rather proud, and wondered if I'd been missing something over the past years when I could so easily have had a promotion. But that was the past. Think of the present, Bill. To my surprise and delight, I took delivery of a BSA 250cc motorcycle, crash helmet and revolver, and a pamphlet about the work of the police. When I took delivery and rode it for the first time, I thought of when I was at Dunkirk and found the baked beans in the back of the ambulance. How the time had flown. I moved out from my mates, hoping that they would always remember our friendship, and joined 3 other boys who'd also been selected to join the police. They came from other companies, and we soon swapped our experiences. All were determined to succeed in making the new police a success. We'd been given the authority, and we all shook hands. I knew that we would make a good team. I soon felt that I had found a good niche for myself in the East Lancs, and devoted my thoughts and energy to the job I'd been entrusted with. It was a very responsible position which would keep me fully occupied mentally and physically. For that I was thankful. On my first patrol, I felt a little strange driving around the area designated to the battalion, wearing my white webbing and gaiters. The 2-man army patrol had now been suspended. The police were responsible, and the civilians seemed to accept our presence without any sign of being resentful. One day I was riding along a road past a cemetery, and there was a wide grass verge, and what appeared to be an empty mass grave, which was almost freshly dug. It was about 8 feet deep and 60 feet long. What a way to be buried! I wondered if it had been prepared for victims of the mass bombing of Hamburg, which had caused so many deaths. When the fraternisation ban was lifted, it was much more agreeable to be able to pass a civil word to people who would say the odd word of greeting, but in English, of course. I never got close enough to them to be able to learn any of their language except the time of day. Most instructions I had to give during the course of my duties were given in sign language, and I did not have any problems in that respect. They had been our bitter enemies for too long to be forgiven so quickly. It would have to be seen whom the victors were without any signs of aggression on our part, and that is how we behaved, going about our responsibilities quietly and purposefully. One of the consequences of being allowed to mix with the public, even to have a drink in their pubs, was that some of the lads got carried away and became attracted to the opposite sex, and after a period of time paid the penalty by catching that dreadful disease we all knew about. The married men amongst them were the first to complain if somebody informed them that their wives were misbehaving. That situation arose many times during the war. Then a soldier would be granted compassionate leave, and after returning would once again seek the opposite sex to do what he'd condemned his wife for. What a life! If the powers that be had given any thought to the matter, our lads would have been issued with the necessary item for safer sex, as the American servicemen were. During my service, I had to attend several courts-martial of soldiers who'd gone absent without leave, the usual reason being that they'd become acquainted with a Fraulein, or Frau for that matter, and could not resist the usual temptation of taking up residence. The military police usually caught up with the miscreant and arrested him. The appropriate unit was then informed, and the regimental police would escort them back to their battalion HQ. I went to Dusseldorf on several occasions for that reason. The usual punishment for AWOL for any length of time would be a term in the Glasshouse military prison, and that was no soft option, as was well known. I visited Hamburg several times on duty, and the destruction was staggering, with a complete collapse of large areas. Hamburg alone paid the penalty for the suffering of Coventry. It had been avenged. There was never a dull moment for me, and there was always interesting work to be done. One of the most distressing of those tasks took place over a period of 3 days. The police had to accompany 6 officers on a very unpleasant duty, but at the same time giving us first-hand insight into what had taken place in Germany over the past years. We went to a large field about 4 miles from our billets, and what we saw had to be seen to be believed. There were literally many thousands of displaced persons standing around with vacant, hungry looks upon their faces, waiting for somebody to guide them and to tell them what was being done to help them. There were other people, half-witted because of their experiences. None of them seemed to know where their families were. All were undernourished, underclothed, and altogether a tragic sight. Those unfortunate folk had been uprooted from their homes and families forcibly from all over the occupied territories and made to contribute every sinew in their bodies to the German war effort by their forced labour in the factories. We set up trestle tables, and an officer, together with a linguist who spoke several languages, sat at each table. We police had to keep order and organise the poor souls into single file to wait their turn to seek a solution to an extremely difficult problem. It was all done by signs on our part because of the many languages involved, but that was no problem since most of them were docile, being well behaved, and just stood there wondering what on earth was to happen to them, as if in a trance. I was at a table all day for 3 days, listening to the very patient officers asking questions, all beyond my comprehension. I thought how marvellous it was to be a linguist, watching those clever men with their voices and signs, trying to get to the bottom of so many problems. The people came from so many different countries, and to me it looked an impossible task. Those people wanted to return to the homes which they'd been forced to leave, but it was easier said than done. Their minds must have been in torment. It was a monumental task which had to be done as quickly and humanely as possible. But meantime they had to be fed and protected against any one of them who'd gone berserk. We had to show sympathy, kindness, firmness, and above all, understanding of the needs of those poor individuals who longed to get back to the folk they expected to find waiting for them. What a tremendous upheaval of humanity the Nazi regime had brought about in their determination to subjugate the once great nations of Europe. It was a marvel that it was ever sorted out. But for many a poor soul, it never would be. Being a witness to what happened over those 3 days was something I will never forget. But for that heaving mass of tragic humanity who paid the penalty with their mental and physical suffering, it would be an almost unbelievable burden which they would take to their graves. The Allies did a monumental job here, and the country should be forever grateful. I was pleased I'd joined the regimental police, because my duties enabled me to see first-hand the aftermath of war in Germany, which I would never otherwise have seen or even believed. I also came to realise that not all Germans wanted the war, with all the consequences which had been forced upon them by a ruthless and heartless dictatorship. End of chapter 23.